Welcome to the 2021 Convocation of the Reformed Institute. That we're disappointed not to be able to welcome each of you in person in our usual home of Stone Hall at National Presbyterian Church. We're thrilled to have guests today from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. Our presenting scholars today, the Reverend Dr. Persavia Prelo and the Reverend Dr. Douglas H. Brown Clark, bring a wealth of insight and a depth of prophetic vision into the sins and blind spots in the practice of the Reformed faith and Black voices of resistance within the Reformed faith that will provide clarity as we seek to discern the leading of the Spirit for Reformed Christians in this moment. We're so pleased to welcome both of them. As we begin, let us pray. God of the ages, we pray for your Spirit to open our minds, our hearts, our eyes and ears to discern your presence among us. Bless Persavia and Doug with all the necessary gifts of the Spirit through the technology available to engage us with our history and to lead us to discern your presence on this day. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage to face our heritage with clear eyes and to let our hearts be broken with the confidence that you always stand ready to heal our broken hearts and fill them with your love and grace through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Reformed Institute to our annual convocation featuring these very, very gifted speakers. Now I want to turn the program over to the Reverend Faye Acker, who is a longtime and beloved member of the National Capital Presbytery, has served Northminster Presbyterian Church and other churches, and has served at Howard University. So welcome, Faye.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Larry. It's my honor to introduce to you today Reverend Dr. Persavia Prelo. Dr. Prelo and I are friends and colleagues. She's pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, where she has served since April 15, 2018. So she's coming on 3 years there. And she's also an adjunct professor of history at Bowie State University, where she teaches African American history. Her roots stretch from the Sea Islands of South Carolina to the skyline of Jersey City, New Jersey, where she was born and raised. She is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament, serving the Presbyterian Church USA in the National Capital area. Prior to teaching at Bowie State University, Dr. Prelo was assistant professor of American history at Augusta University. And as you'll see, she's gone where God has led her. She's earned a PhD in American history, an MA in education policy, and a master's in history, all from the University of Illinois. She has an MDiv from Columbia Theological Seminary, a master's of sacred theology from Lutheran Theology at Southern Seminary, and a BA in history at Drew University. Dr. Prelo has some deep and wide research interests, but she focuses on 20th century race relations, American religious history, African American social equality, and the history of education. She has a current book project that she's working on called Educating the Talented 10th. This university students, the politics of race leadership and the struggle for African American equality. She's also completing a manuscript on the mission work of Black women ruling elders in Black Presbyterian churches in the Carolinas. She serves as vice chair of the board of directors of the Presbyterian Historical Society, is a member of the Presbyterian Mission Agency, Mission Development Resource Committee, the DC Mayor's Interfaith Council, and she serves and has served on the strategy team of Next Church and the Alumni Council of Columbia Theological Seminary. Now, in all of her callings and within all her endeavors, Dr. Prelow's greatest desire is to use all of her gifts that God has given to her in service to God's people and to God's church. She is called to embrace a model of transformative leadership as she lives her life at that intersection of prophetic ministry, of impactful pastoral care that makes a difference, and collegiate teaching and research that promotes change, not just teaching for the ivory tower, but what does it mean down on the ground in the world? Thank you so much. It's my great honor to present Reverend Dr. Presbyterian Prelow to you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us near and far. And Reverend Faye, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction as well. I'm simply excited and delighted to be here with you all to share in this dialogue on Black Presbyterians and racial justice. 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the congregation that I pastor, is located in our nation's capital at the intersection of 15th and R. But today I am sharing with you on the topic of Black Presbyterians and racial justice from the confines of my own home. It really is indeed an honor to be here with you. I've been looking forward to sharing in this topic for quite some time. Today, I will be speaking from the topic of resilient faith, Reverend Francis Grimke and the Black Grimke family, racial justice in the age of certainty. My talk today is really situated in the context of the earliest 20th century, during the time that Reverend Francis Grimke was pastor of the congregation that I currently pastor. We have learned a lot about the story of the Reformed Church as lived through the Presbyterian experience in these United States of America. But we also must understand that when we think about our nation and its diversity and sometimes its divisiveness, what is really needed is an opportunity to understand each other's narrative. As we think about what it means to shape the Reformed tradition, and we understand the importance of reformed and always reforming, part of what we understand the church to be today is based on our reality of understanding how the Spirit of God manifests itself in the context of the lived realities of diverse peoples of faith. So today, this panel, this conversation looks at the lived realities of Black Presbyterians in their pursuits of racial justice. I'll be highlighting specific leaders in the context of a Black Presbyterian history. I confessed early on that within the context of 35 minutes, I cannot really do justice to the topic. But I hope that in my sharing, I'll be able to introduce you to an important aspect of our Presbyterian history and identity. I remember sitting yesterday with a board meeting of the Presbyterian Historical Society, where I serve as vice chair of the board, and it was a getting to know you conversation. So we spent our time sharing stories that connected us. And so I shared about the first time that I was introduced to the Presbyterian Church USA. I was a doctoral student working on my PhD in American history at the University of Illinois, and I was looking for a topic to do research on. That led me to the Presbyterian Historical Society, where I was doing research on schools founded for African Americans in the South, not knowing that one day I would grow up and become a Presbyterian pastor. But we have learned, for example, that history has been shaped and reshaped by a number of dynamic tensions. Among them, religious faith, convictions about race and gender, and yearnings for freedom, and the compulsion and power to control. The heritage of Black Presbyterians is a heritage forged along every single historical marker in our nation's history, from slavery all the way through Black Lives Matter. Today, after exploring a broader evolution of the history of Black Presbyterians, I'd like to focus my talk on the Grimke family and the roles that they have played in promoting not only racial justice, but also justice for people regardless of difference. Reconciliation was the locus of what the Grimke family fought for and advocated. So too was the experience and is the experience of being Black and Presbyterian in these United States. Presbyterians have a rich history in our nation's country. I think we can all agree. That's why we're here today for Convocation, as we raise critical questions about what it means to still be Presbyterian in these United States today. But let's hone in today on the experience of African American Presbyterians. From their founding origins during and beyond the paternal institution of American slavery, and following the Civil War and Reconstruction, Black Presbyterian churches, primarily located in the Carolinas, have gone through many seasons of growth and development. While these congregations were first chartered, they were founded by white Northern missionaries who were concerned about uplifting newly freed Blacks through education and religion. Some churches, too, of course, were founded by the Southern Church. Black Presbyterian congregations launched schools, health centers, and social and civic organizations that contributed to the uplift of African American communities, especially as many enslaved people made the transition from slavery to freedom. As a result, Black Presbyterian churches were well connected and integrated into their communities. Wherever they were located, Black Presbyterian congregations had an impact on their community. Before I became pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, I pastored a rural Presbyterian congregation in Winsboro, South Carolina. And that congregation was founded right after the Civil War started. So we can see that when we think about the pursuit of African American equality, in fact, it was W.E.B. Du Bois who said this: "We've lived longer as a nation under the institution of slavery than we have under the experiment of freedom." So African American Presbyterian churches and as faith communities are living this experiment, right, of being free and educated under the conquest of integration. So as much as African Americans have pursued equality, African American Presbyterian churches have weathered and ebbed and flowed between this pursuit of equality in our nation after Reconstruction. But the present history and current congregational realities facing Black Presbyterian churches is connected with this duality, being Black and Presbyterian. Du Bois calls it the souls of Black folk when he talks about the duality of being Black and American. Well, African American Presbyterians have a duality of being Black culturally, but also too Reformed in the context of their faith community. But this is to say that there is a rich, rich, rich history of African American Presbyterian churches and congregations. Some early history before I jump into the Grimke family narrative. The first African American Presbyterian church was actually founded in Philadelphia. It was founded in 1807 by Reverend John Gluckhoster. He traveled to Philadelphia in 1807 and appealed to the presbytery to become a licensed preacher, and thus began his journey with this moniker: the mother church of African American Presbyterianism. If you think about the development of the Presbyterian church in North Carolina and South Carolina, you'll also find that the rich diversity or the rich numerical diversity of Black Presbyterian churches too are located in the Carolinas. But wherever there was a church, there was also a school. I shared the story of traveling to the Presbyterian Historical Society. My first interest in African American Presbyterian history dealt with schools. And so I have 4 schools listed on this slide. Barbara Scotia School College was founded in 1867 in Concord, North Carolina. Knoxville College was founded in 1875 in Knoxville, Tennessee. Stillman College in 1876, and Johnson C. Smith University and also seminary in 1876, which is to show that as much as African Americans have a rich and storied history in the context of the Presbyterian Church USA, it is not separate from the history of education that Presbyterians by and large have invested in. So wherever there was a church, there was a school, and sometimes the church building and the school building were one and the same. This becomes very important to understand the narrative of racial justice and equality that the Grimke family pursued, because their narrative is one of transitioning from South Carolina to New Jersey and back to DC. But these schools, historically Black colleges and universities, on the heels of Reconstruction, there really was no sustained educational infrastructure all throughout the South. So the whole context of race uplift really dealt with the ways in which institutions were built to really promote African American progress. So when we think about Black Presbyterians and racial justice, we also have to think about these two significant institutions founded in our African American historical narrative, and that is the church and also Black colleges. The whole push for equality and forging of cultural norms really was birthed out of the duality of those institutions, the Black church and Black colleges. Many of these Black colleges that were Presbyterian started out as single-sex institutions. Barbara Scotia College, for example, was a merger of two schools, a seminary for Black women and a school for Black men. Over time, many of these schools and universities closed as local school districts throughout the South developed more educational institutions. Today, these are the last four standing Presbyterian-related African American colleges and universities. But what we understand too is that Black colleges also became shaping ground. W.E.B. Du Bois in his pioneering scholarship talks about the Black talented 10, which means that the best and brightest of the race are educated so that they can go out into the field, the mission field, let's call it, and educate the masses of people. Here we have on this slide one Miss Lucy Craft Laney, who developed the Haynes Memorial Industrial Institute. During my time as a professor of history at Augusta State University, again, I wasn't even starting my Presbyterian journey. Way before I even enrolled in Columbia Seminary, I worshiped at a church called Tabernacle Baptist Church, and it was right next to the Lucy Craft Laney Museum for African American History. This is the only museum in our nation that is developed off of the lived realities of a Black Presbyterian woman. What is so significant about Lucy Craft Laney is that she was educated in Presbyterian-related schools and colleges and universities. Her dad, as well, was also a Presbyterian minister. So when it came time to developing the Haynes Memorial Institute in 1883, she needed funding to support this work. So she appealed to Presbyterian women all throughout the country. She attended General Assembly and other conventions to raise money. She developed the first school for African Americans in Augusta, Georgia. What I'm trying to chart is the ways in which education uplift was really linked to creating a foundation for racial progress and racial justice. Lucy Craft Laney developed this school, and this school really was like a community center. It was a place where children were educated. It was a place where teachers were nurtured, but it really was a community center. Fast forward, the house where she really developed the school was right across the street from Christ Presbyterian Church, the first Black Presbyterian church in Augusta, Georgia. Both of those institutions together existed in the segregated environment called Augusta, Georgia. And from both institutions, Lucy Craft Laney became very active in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She becomes representative of a generation of Black women who belonged to sororities, were active in schools, and also really push social and civic progress. But she was known as the mother of children in that she really helped to develop the importance of education for Blacks in Augusta, Georgia. Today, the Haynes Memorial Institute is now Lucy Craft Laney High School. So we understand the ways in which it's important to memorialize the lived realities of African American Presbyterian leaders. This now brings me to introducing the reality that not only was the church, not only was the school an essential aspect of the Presbyterian narrative for African Americans, but so too is the church. 15th Street Presbyterian Church is a significant congregation related to African American history, not just because I pastor that congregation, but because it is in our nation's capital and it has existed long enough to weather many, many of the realities that congregations face. When we think about Lucy Craft Laney and we think about the relationship between her life and the church, we are also realizing that many Black leaders came out of the church. And so first I want to mention that 15th Street Presbyterian Church is a pioneering organization whose foundation and mission is based on the ethos of social justice. This building on the left is an image of 15th Street Presbyterian Church that was located at an intersection of 15th and R in Washington, D.C. And the image on the right, the more modern image, is what the congregation looks like today. We've gone through 3 different reiterations of buildings. Reverend Henry Hyden Garnett was one of the earlier pastors of 15th Street Presbyterian Church. He was an ardent abolitionist and orator and served as pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church from 1864 until 1866, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment, officially ending slavery. And in the United States, Garnett was invited to preach a sermon before the House of Representatives. I begin with this image of Garnett just to really illustrate what was going on with Black Presbyterians toward the end of the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction. As much as there was questions about the place of African Americans who were enslaved in light of the broader Presbyterian church, as we know, there was a separation between the Northern church and the Southern church because of the question of slavery. And it really wouldn't be until the early 1980s when both the Northern Church and the Southern Church would reunite and we would do away with segregated African American presbyteries. But Henry Highland Garnett already was raising the questions of African American inclusion, not only in the context of the broader Presbyterian Church, but the broader American society as well. So when we think about 15th Street Presbyterian Church, not just because it was in the context of our nation's capital, but really the pastors of 15th Street Presbyterian Church were at the fore of promoting racial justice. Henry Highland Garnett served only for 2 years. But I want to begin with Reverend Francis Grimke as the main heart of the remainder of my time. So beyond a history of Black colleges, beyond a history of the founding early churches organized by Presbyterian pastors, we can look at the history of racial justice through the lived experiences of the Grimke family. How do we understand the ways in which Black Presbyterians as people of faith transition from slavery to freedom? The narrative of the Grimke family, the Black Grimke family, provides a window into which we can understand the complexities of race, of place, all in the pursuit of racial justice in what I call the age of uncertainty. The age of uncertainty for me is really the timing beyond the end of the Civil War on through the present. Again, as I quoted Du Bois a few moments ago, we've lived longer as a nation under the institution of slavery than we have under the experiment of integration. So Reverend Francis Grimke says this: unless there comes to the nation a greater emancipation than Lincoln's proclamation effected, it is doomed. It is bound to go down. So in one respect, you can have the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared slavery to be illegal in those states that were still in rebellion against the Union. But Reverend Francis Grimke in his pastorate understood that we needed not only a legislation change, meaning a law that eradicated slavery, but we needed systems and structures to really move toward equality of opportunity and freedom. So Reverend Francis Grimke was born into slavery. The legacy of slavery was a deep imprint upon his calling. What we know is that Reverend Francis Grimke was an American Presbyterian minister in D.C. He was regarded for more than a half century as one of the leading African American clergy of his era and was prominent in working for equal rights. He was active in the Niagara movement and helped to develop the National Association for Colored People in 1909. Grimke was the second of 3 sons born to Henry Grimke, a white European slave owner of Charleston, South Carolina, and Nancy Weston, don't miss it, an enslaved woman of European and African descent. After becoming a widower, the senior Grimke began a relationship with Weston, so much so that he moved her out of the city to his plantation where they and their family would have more privacy. And with Weston, he went on to birth 3 children. She was an enslaved woman. She was his official domestic partner in the house. You fill in the lines. Both Henry and Nancy Weston gave Francis and his brothers, Archibald and John, their first lessons in reading and writing. Henry Grimke came from a large family. Among them were 2 sisters, Sarah and Angelina, who were well-known abolitionists who moved to the North to join activists. His other siblings continued to represent the family in the South. Henry Grimke died in 1852. His dying left a void. What would become of the Black Grimke family, Nancy and her children, Archibald and Henry Francis Grimke? Henry tried to protect his second family by willing Nancy, who was pregnant with their third child, to one of his other sons. Archibald and Francis was willed to Montague Grimke. But there was trouble. They were not treated as members of the broader white Grimke household. Henry's sister Eliza was the executor of the will, brought the family to Charleston, and allowed the Black Grimkes, Nancy and Archibald and Francis, to live as free Blacks. After the Civil War ended, the three Grimke boys attended freedmen schools where their talents were recognized by teachers. They gained support and sent Archibald and Francis to the North. They both studied at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, another Black Presbyterian college. Francis and his brother went through many hardships afterwards, as their father had not provided for them financially. After the Civil War, which disrupted family fortunes further, Francis and Archibald were enrolled at the Morris Street School. And ultimately, in 1868, Angelina Grimke again noted Archibald Grimke's surname in the Anti-Slavery Standard after a speech was reported. Because of the unusual name, she wrote him and asked about his family's origin. They connected the dots, and Francie understood that Angelina Grimke was his aunt. Francis and Archibald both graduated from Lincoln Seminary. Francis went on to graduate in studies from Princeton Seminary in 1878, and ultimately moved on to become pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Here we have images of Reverend Francis Grimke as a young scholar, as a young pastor. We can see the progression of change over time, which is what history is. But he started pastoring 15th Street Presbyterian Church early on in his seminary studies. And what we understand is that I remember reading through some of the primary documents which actually listed his salary early on upon his arrival at 15th Street. But a little bit now about Archibald Grimke before I transition back to Francis. Archibald Grimke was an American lawyer, intellectual journalist, a diplomat, and community leader in the 19th and early 20th century. He graduated from Freedman School, including Lincoln, as I mentioned, Harvard Law School, and served as American consul to the Dominican Republic from 1894 to 1898. He too was active in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. After getting established in his law firm practice in Boston, he married a white woman and they moved out to the Midwest, and they wed and had a daughter. Ultimately, his wife died of suicide, and so Archibald was left to raise his daughter, and both of them relocated back to Washington, D.C. His daughter was Angelina, who became a teacher and writer, who I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. But this is to say that you have these two brothers born and raised in slavery in South Carolina. They are educated in Presbyterian-related schools and find themselves in higher education. One becomes a pastor, a clergy person, who really becomes the moral compass of the country, and another becomes a lawyer. But together, in the context of D.C., they find and develop ways to promote racial justice and to promote change, even as we are yet still living through the experiment of integration. And so back to Reverend Francis Grimke. Grimke began his ministry at 15th Street Presbyterian Church. He led the congregation until 1885, relocated to another church. They loved him so much, we brought him back. And then he went on to continue to pastor 15th Street Presbyterian Church through 1937. But really think about this time period. Between 1887 is the end of the post-Reconstruction period through 1937. This is really the time in American history where African Americans have lived with the nation through World War I and on the cusp of World War II. And at the same token, what it means to lift oneself up by one's bootstrap. And so Reverend Francis Grimke is pastoring 15th Street in a time of rapid change and growth in the development of African American progress. There's a significant migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and all those African Americans who were educated in Presbyterian schools in the rural South found a Presbyterian church in our nation's capital. Many of them landed in Washington, D.C. Although today most members of 15th Street are true Washingtonians, if you go back 1, 2, or 3 generations, you will find that many of them trace their roots back to South Carolina in the region. Francis Grimke was ordained to serve as pastor of this congregation. Some scholars called 15th Street membership the home of the Black bourgeoisie, which meaning that it epitomized, in some respects, the who's who of Washington, D.C. across the Black community. 15th Street Presbyterian Church went on to develop the first Black schools in Washington, D.C. It went on to develop organization. A lot of what happens in the neighborhood of 15th Street, a historic Black community, was well connected to 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Now, I do confess that there were other faith communities that developed in terms of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Black Baptist Church. But 15th Street Presbyterian Church is the congregation, the first and oldest Black Presbyterian church founded in Washington, D.C., and upwards of other congregations spinning off as well. The congregation was founded by John F. Cook, who was the first Black Presbyterian pastor in the city. He was born enslaved. And what we understand, too, is that he really develops this legacy of social service and giving. Church was vital to the community that 15th Street was located in. The church had been a religious, educational, and social center since its founding. It was the first home of the preparatory school for colored youth, the city's first Black public high school, and the first Black high school in the United States of America. But when Francis Grimke arrived to Washington, D.C., he was a young man. And he married another well-known Black woman about abolitionists. And her name is Charlotte Fortin Grimke. Way before Charlotte Fortin Grimke marries Francis Grimke, she was well known in her own right and had an established career of racial justice. In December of 1878, Grimke married Charlotte Fortin. She was an abolitionist, a teacher, and a diarist. She was the granddaughter of James Fortin, a prominent member of the free Black elites of Philadelphia. Among her acquaintances were many members of the National Abolitionist Movement, including William Lloyd Garrison, Sarah Parker Redmond, and many others. Charlotte was 41, and Francis was about 13 years her junior when they married. In 1880, they had one daughter named Theodora, who died in infancy. But let's look at Charlotte Fortin Grimke for a moment. The granddaughter of a wealthy salesmaker and the niece of Harriet Fortin Purvis, Charlotte grew up in a privileged Black family in Philadelphia and New England. When her mother died in 1840, she was raised by various members of her extended family. She was very active in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Fortin was the first Black teacher to work with missions schools established in the South Carolina Sea Islands. And so her experiences coming to D.C. to teach, she found herself as a member of 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Her and Reverend Francis Grimke took a liking, as young people say today, to one another. And this couple becomes a pioneering couple that promoted racial justice both within the ministries of 15th Street Presbyterian Church and beyond. They were very active in the social and civic circles of the D.C. community. They wrote letters to Congress. They wrote letters to the president. They continue to advocate for equality with an intersection through the lens of faith. In many respects, their marriage becomes a moral compass through which members viewed what it meant to be free and Black in Washington, D.C. A quote from Grimke: "When the U.S. government shows a proper appreciation of the services of the Negro, who has never failed in every crisis of its history to do his whole duty to shed his blood freely in its behalf, then and not till then will I be heard." What we see from these various quotes about Reverend Francis Grimke is that he had a prolific power when it came to writing. He, in many respects, had a career of social action. He wrote an address to President Woodrow Wilson in 1912. He protested the color line of segregation in employment in the federal government. In many respects, he wrote prolifically on moral thought and equality, even in the midst of the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Much like 2020, Fast forward 100 years backwards, Reverend Francis Grimke was advocating racial justice at the turn of the century during the time when we had a multiplicity of, dare I say, pandemics. There was a pandemic of the Spanish flu crisis of 1918, which feasibly shut down all churches in the region. But there was also the pandemic of race. DC was very much a segregated city. Sometimes we can call DC a southern city. Other times we can call it the mid-Atlantic. But it had the dynamics of racial tension that really was embraced by our whole country. And so Reverend Francis Grimke wrote about this color line that he saw existing all throughout the DC metropolitan region. But on the topic of addressing Woodrow Wilson, he says these words: "I said to myself that no American citizen, white or black, need have reasonable fear from an administration of a man who feels as he does, who believes as he does in the word of God. It is a comforting thought, especially to those who are struggling against great odds, to know that the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, the God of the Bible reveals, is on the throne, and that under him a vice regent will be a man who has the courage, amen, of his convictions, and who will not falter when duty calls." And so this is Reverend Francis Grimke writing to President Woodrow Wilson, encouraging him to be a man who leads from the courage of his convictions. But Grimke also protested the color line in DC. Not a full year after Wilson had extended the color line in government departments and forced Black people, some doubtless members of 15th Street, to lose valued positions in the civil service, Grimke wrote a very different letter to the president requesting an earnest protest. He was deeply disappointed that Wilson was not surprised in that he would get a letter from Grimke, but he was deeply disappointed of this segregation in federal employment. As an American citizen, he states, "I desire to enter my earnest protest against the disposition under your administration to desegregate colored people in various departments of the government. To do so is undemocratic, is un-American, is un-Christian, is needless to offend the self-respect of loyal Black citizens of the Republic." In other words, Grimke argues, race prejudice can't be talked down. It must be lived down. I'll state that again. In other words, race prejudice can't be talked down. It must be lived down. Today, we would call Francis Grimke, Reverend Francis Grimke, a public theologian. His ministry was not just a pulpit of 15th Street, but in many respects, his pulpit was all of Washington, D.C., and a multiplicity of journals and periodicals where he published his sermons. He was known to walk around, to travel with copies of his printed sermons and his printed lectures, sharing with anyone and everyone who would listen. So Francis Grimke understood the importance of being like John the Baptist, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. I'd like to also share another quote. It's very interesting to think about promoting racial justice in the context of a major health pandemic. And again, I'm speaking of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Grimke has these words to offer in reference to the church. Again, at this time, churches were closed. So 100 years later, we're living through the same reality. And so he states this about the problems of restricted civil liberties in terms of the ban on congregations. Another thing that has impressed me in connection with this pandemic is the fact that conditions may arise in the community which justify the extraordinary exercise of powers that would not be tolerated under ordinary circumstances. This ordinary exercise of power was resorted to by the commissioners in closing of theaters, schools, churches, and forbidding all gatherings in any considerable number of people indoors and outdoors. It seems to me, however, in a matter like this, that it is always wise to submit to such restrictions for the time. If, as a matter of fact, it was dangerous to meet in the theaters and the schools, it is certainly even dangerous to meet in churches. The fact that the churches were places of religious gatherings and others not would affect, in the least, the health of people. I have been able to resume work, and I have been patient for churches to open. And Grimke went on to speak prolifically about equal rights until the very moment that he retired from 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Other pastors have come and gone, but none have served as long as Grimke under the leadership of the Shared Council of Governance at 15th Street. But he served for 50 years. And although there has been one major book written by a historian at Howard University on his career, many don't know about the contributions that he made to African American social justice and racial progress. That is to say that when we think about the narrative of Black Presbyterian history and to raise this question of how Black Presbyterians in and of themselves have reshaped and continue to reshape, reformed and always reforming, have continued to reshape what we understand about the Reformed tradition, we know that a lot of it is based on just living out their faith. I'll end with this story. Angelina Well Grimke was the daughter of Archibald Grimke, Francis Grimke's brother. She was raised in many respects by Charlotte and her uncle Francis. Angelina Well Grimke goes on to become a major proponent of the equal rights for women. And what I wanted to do was to be able to chart racial progress from a family that has Presbyterian roots over time. Angelina Well Grimke was an American journalist, teacher, playwright, poet, and activist who was recognized as a foremother of the Harlem Renaissance. She was very active. She was named after her white aunt, abolitionist Angelina Grimke. In 1883, when she was only 3 years old, her mother and father left, but she was raised by her aunt and uncle. In 1903, her father had died, and so she moved in and was a teacher and educator all throughout the District of Columbia. But she is known most vehemently for her poetry, looking at anti-lynching, looking at voting rights for women. But she, in many respects, continued the legacy of her uncle and her dad. And so when we think about the Black Grimke family, we know that there was a white Grimke family, very active in abolitionist circles and also very active in slavery. But if we chart the genealogy of the Black Grimkes, we see in and of itself a few criteria. We see a family birthed out of slavery. We see a family nurtured by the Black church and nurtured by Presbyterian schools and organization, but we also see their experiences intimately linked to the quest for equality. And so my contribution to today's discussion is that when we think about Black Presbyterians in advocating for racial justice, their experiences were uniquely shaped by the church and by their education. And they went on to develop important policies, important movements, all throughout the National Presbyterian Church USA. And many of the push for equality can be found in the leadership of prior individuals like Francis Grimke. And so I end with this thought. That's really to understand Du Bois' sentiment that we live longer as a nation under the institution of slavery than we have as a color line. It's a sentiment that still shapes the reality of being Black and Presbyterian in these United States. We have a tradition of a Black Presbyterian cultural church, but we also have a large mainline denomination that has some semblance of diversity. But how do we worship beyond the spaces that we inherit on Sunday mornings, although those spaces tend to be virtual now? Some scholars describing the church have said that the most segregated hour in Christendom in the United States is the 11 a.m. hour. I contend and confess that pastoring and teaching and preaching and writing scholarship in the age of this pandemic has brought us all closer together. And as I think about what it means to look at the heritage of Black Presbyterians in their fight for racial justice, I also want to say that there is a unique calling among Black Presbyterians, that their presence in the larger Presbyterian church points us to the importance of being in intercultural dialogue beyond our racialized experiences in this faith community known as the Presbyterian Church USA. So I thank you all for your attention. I do believe that I am at time. I look forward to engaging with more of you during our Q&A. Thank you all for your time today.
Before we do move to Dr. Clark, I would like to do a brief introduction of him. And I will Dr. Clark is a visiting professor of history at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He teaches courses there on American, African American, and Africana religious history as part of the growing Black Church Studies program at Louisville. He also teaches church history at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky. Dr. Clark received a BA from Davidson College. We welcome members of the Davidson community to this gathering today who are joining us. And there he studied African American and American religious history with a focus on race, civil rights, and reparations. He studied, did his PhD at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And there he earned second honors and was student body president. He also did a dissertation on Gayraud Wilmore, who is one of the leading African-American prophets and theologians in the Presbyterian Church. And we respect his memory today, very passing, I believe, last year. Dr. Wilmore had a big following in the DC region and spent his final days here in this area. Currently, Dr. Clark is working on a book entitled A Solid Black Hyphen, Race, Religion, Identity, and Black Power Activism of Gayraud Wilmore. Indeed, he's become the leading expert of Dr. Wilmore's work in the scholarly world. This book will examine the history of religion in the civil rights and Black Power movements, with a focus on late 1960s Black clergy advocates for reparations that also accompanied Dr. Wilmore's struggle and his work. Clark's research has had support as a research fellow with the Presbyterian Historical Society. It's good to see that both of our speakers are connected with that body. And also as a fellow in Vanderbilt's program in theology and practice. He chairs the Southeast Regional American Academy of Religions History of Christianity section. Very involved in the ongoing work of academic scholarly work. He previously chaired Vanderbilt's Graduate Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and he is an ordained Presbyterian minister, an active family with children, and living that dual life of work and parenting that so many people do engage in today. So I'd like us all to welcome Dr. Clark to share his words with us.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for having me for this wonderful event. I am honored to get to speak today alongside Dr. Prelo, who is a gifted scholar and pastor. We actually met a couple of years ago when I was visiting with Reverend Dr. Gayraud Wilmore to interview him in DC, and he had heard about this new pastor at 15th Street Presbyterian, and he wanted to go hear her preach. And so I got to go with him to go meet Dr. Prelo and hear her preach. So it's wonderful to be with you, Dr. Prelo, and thank you for your message this morning. My research, as you've heard, my dissertation that I'm now revising to publish as a book is a biography of Dr. Wilmore. He is an important figure for many groups of people all over the world. But I know that he has a special significance for folks in the Washington area because he lived here for the last 20 years of his life until his passing last April of 2020. So I'm sure that many of you knew him personally, and it's wonderful to get a chance to gather with some fellow friends and admirers of Dr. Wilmore. I know that some of you don't know about Dr. Wilmore, and so I'll be very happy to tell you a little what I know of him. Our task today, as noted in the title of this event, is to lift up the history of Black Presbyterians and racial justice and the ways that Black Presbyterians have reshaped or reframed or reformed the Reformed tradition in the United States. I'm focusing here on one Black Presbyterian, Gayraud Wilmore. And I would contend that he and the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon are the two most influential Black Presbyterians of the past century. So I'm going to look at a couple of ways, and among the most influential Presbyterians, period, of that time. So I'm going to look at a couple of ways that Dr. Wilmore reshaped the Reformed tradition from within in the direction of racial justice. And I want to do this in the spirit of celebrating the tradition of Black Presbyterianism. Historians are sometimes critical people. They mess around with the ways that we want to remember our history. They always want to complicate things. And I'm a historian, but I'm celebrating today. And I think, we need things to celebrate in this year of COVID and police violence, the election, the attack on the US Capitol by a white supremacist lynch mob right where many of you all live in the DC area. This year has been really traumatic for many of us. And so I want to take a chance just to celebrate and to celebrate the life of Dr. Wilmore and the profound heritage of Black Presbyterians. So I'm going to say a little about Dr. Wilmore's contributions to the birth of the civil rights movement, about his involvement in the Black Power movement and promoting reparations, and about how he drew on the Reformed tradition in order to develop the tradition known as Black theology. I'm going to start off, though, by telling you about how Dr. Wilmore came to be a Presbyterian. Gayraud Wilmore grew up in North Philadelphia in the 1920s and 30s in a low-income Black neighborhood during the Great Migration, as Dr. Prelo has mentioned, the Great Migration, when many African Americans were moving from the South to northern cities. And this migration led to another kind of migration, a white flight, when white people moved out of those cities into the suburbs because they didn't want to live near Black people. And when those white people left, they vacated their old church buildings. Wilmore's father, who's actually Gayraud Wilmore Sr., was a prominent community leader and activist in that period, and he and a friend named John Rice had founded a community organization called the North Philadelphia Civic League. One day, some white Presbyterian officials approached these two men and said, "You all can have this church building, which is a 500-person capacity, a gym, a bowling alley, 15 classrooms, on the condition that you form a new Presbyterian congregation in that building." They agreed, and those families became Presbyterian overnight, and the officers of the North Philadelphia Civic League all became elders, and they formed the McDowell Community Presbyterian Church, which has sometimes been referred to as the North Philadelphia Civic League at its knees. The younger Gayraud Wilmore, the one who I'm mostly talking about today, was 15 years old at the time. And so this might seem like kind of an odd, idiosyncratic story, but it was actually representative. The same thing happened elsewhere because, again, of the Great Migration and white flight. This is how St. Augustine Presbyterian in the Bronx was founded under Edler Hawkins, who would become the first Black moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And it's also how the Church of the Master was founded in Harlem under James Robinson. All three of these major Black Presbyterian churches were founded within 1 year of each other in 1937 and 38, all of them in buildings vacated by white Presbyterian congregations. So, anyway, that's the story of how Gayraud Wilmore became a Presbyterian. Of course, he would eventually go on to write the book, Black and Presbyterian. So that's where it started. Gayraud Wilmore went to college and seminary at Lincoln University in rural Pennsylvania, as Dr. Prelo noted, a historically Black Presbyterian university with one of just two Black Presbyterian seminaries in the country at the time, that one and Johnson C. Smith Seminary in Charlotte. His schooling was interrupted by serving in combat in Italy in World War II. Then he came back to Lincoln after the war, and he and lots of other Lincoln students started getting involved in sit-ins. Now, we think of civil rights sit-ins as getting started around 1960 in places like Greensboro and Nashville and Raleigh. But these young Black, mostly Presbyterian college students were doing sit-ins in Pennsylvania as early as 1947. So civil rights historians will sometimes talk about a long civil rights movement, looking at the earliest roots of the movement back in the 30s and the 40s. And this is a part of that. These weren't the first sit-ins. I know there were at least some sit-ins by Howard students in DC in 1943, but still 1947 was pretty early. Lincoln University is just outside the town of Oxford, Pennsylvania, which was a segregated town just 5 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. And these Lincoln students engaged in a campaign throughout the 40s and 50s that they called the Oxford Campaign, or Operation Oxford, to desegregate restaurants and movie theaters, including by doing sit-ins. Gayraud Wilmore participated in these sit-ins, but his biggest contribution to this movement was in his senior year in 1947, when he was the editor of the student newspaper, using his editorial position to defend the actions of some of the activists who were seen as a little more out there. The chair of the student NAACP chapter, Milton Henry, was seen as a bit of a loose cannon, as sort of extreme. And Wilmore used his editorial position, his position of institutional power and kind of respectability, to say to folks, you might not like Milton Henry's style or his tactics, but he is right in leading this sit-in movement, and we should support him. Wilmore wrote, quote, "On occasion, he may be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of Milton Henry has nothing to do with the rightness of Milton Henry's fight for civil rights in Oxford. Jim Crow in Oxford must go. We can and must back Henry and the NAACP to the limit." Wilmore would use that kind of strategy and style again later in his career, a strategy of using his position as a seemingly moderate, respectable citizen to vouch for a more radical, disreputable figure. So anyway, historians will argue about what event really started the civil rights movement, like the Montgomery bus boycott or the Brown versus Board decision. But this Operation Oxford, led by a band of Black, mostly Presbyterian college students at Lincoln University, is as good a candidate as any if you want to pinpoint when and where the civil rights movement began. Wilmore went on to graduate from college and seminary at Lincoln. He was a valedictorian in both programs. He served as a pastor in the Philadelphia suburbs, where he helped desegregate his son's elementary school. He worked in campus ministry. He was the first Black staffer in the social action office of the Presbyterian Church. He taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as the first Black professor at that seminary. And then in 1963, the Presbyterian Church felt really convicted by the civil rights movement, specifically by the Birmingham campaign led by Dr. King. And it was also facing a lot of internal pressure from Black Presbyterians in the denomination who were demanding action. And so the United Presbyterian Church, the Northern Presbyterian Church, it became the first majority white denomination to create an agency focused on racial justice, the Committee on Religion and Race. Wilmore was appointed as the executive director, and he served in that role until 1971. He was at all the big marches. He helped guide the church in contributing lots of funds to support civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They worked to promote voter registration in Mississippi and to lobby for passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. One of the most interesting things that I found in my research was a key connection between the Reformed tradition and the creation of Black theology. And you'll see that in Wilmore's story. Now, sometimes people use the term Black theology or Black liberation theology to refer to the theology of all Black Christians, or at least all Black American Christians seeking racial justice going back hundreds of years. So they'll talk about religion of enslaved persons as sometimes a kind of Black theology. That's not how I'm using the term. I'm talking specifically about the academic field and discourse of Black theology that starts in the 1960s and is most closely associated with James Cone. In fact, I would argue that Gayraud Wilmore is the one who coined the term Black theology, and was the person most responsible for coming up with the basic idea that undergirded this movement for Black theology, and that in doing so, he was actually drawing directly on the Reformed tradition. In 1958, there was a merger of two Presbyterian denominations, and the denominations decided to create a new confession to mark that occasion. So they chose a drafting committee to write the new confession, which became the Confession of 1967, because that's the year when it became official. This is also when the denomination came up with the idea to have a book of confessions. So instead of just one confession, the Westminster Confession, they now had 8 confessions, and those all came from different times and places, reflecting a more complex view of church tradition and context. This new confession of 67, it also directly addressed racial justice. Wilmore was on the drafting committee, and he wrote the initial draft of the passages in that confession that condemn racial discrimination, economic oppression, and militarism. So Presbyterians here, if you read or recite from that confession, you can thank Gayraud Wilmore for those sections. However, Wilmore overall had a really negative experience on that committee. He didn't feel like he was listened to or that his opinion was valued. And the most glaring illustration of what life was like for him on that committee was its membership. There were about 15 people on that committee, all of them white men except for 2. Wilmore was the only person of color, and there was one white woman, Janet Harbison. And Janet Harbison, who was a major figure in her own right, she nevertheless believed that she was chosen because her husband was a church historian and they wanted his input, not so much her input on the committee. So Wilmore and Harbison were not really treated as full members. They were there because the committee thought they needed one woman and one Black person, but no more than that. Wilmore sort of drops off the committee around 1963 or 64. He doesn't formally resign, he just quits showing up to the meetings. And that's partly because he felt like he was marginalized on the committee, and because he had a ton of other stuff going on. He was doing really important work in leading the church's racial justice agency. So I'll come back in a minute to that confession committee and tell you why it's important. But first I want to bring in the Black Power movement. So starting in the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement shifts its focus from nonviolent marches in the South to a series of rebellions or insurrections, which critics sometimes called riots, in non-Southern cities, in Watts, in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Newark, really in every major city, especially in the North and on the West Coast. These demonstrators were inspired by civil rights, but they were also responding to economic inequalities and police violence. This period was a turning point for Wilmore because he suddenly identified with the civil rights movement in a way that he hadn't previously. He had already been really involved, but something about that shift to the northern cities struck a chord with him. And the first indication of this change in Wilmore became evident at a sacred place for many Presbyterians, you may know, Montreat Conference Center in North Carolina. If you've been to Montreat before, you know people often have moments of clarity and calling at conferences in Montreat, and Wilmore actually had sort of a moment himself there at a conference in Montreat. Some of you know that Dr. King spoke at Montreat at a Christian Action Conference in August 1965. Well, Gayraud Wilmore was also on the conference program. King's speech at Montreat was delayed because he was in Watts dealing with the aftermath of the Watts Rebellion. Wilmore had also been in Watts, but he was able to get out earlier than King, and so King and Wilmore swapped their speaking slots. Wilmore spoke in place of King early in the conference, and then King came and spoke a few days later. So Wilmore gave the opening speech of this conference, and he immediately came to the defense of the Watts rebels. He tried to translate what the protesters were really saying. And this echoed the way that he had defended his fellow Lincoln University students back when they were engaged in sit-ins, by translating the activism of folks who seemed really out there into language that was more palatable to moderates, in this case, to white people. He said, again, speaking from Anderson Auditorium in Montreat, quote, "The demonstrators out of the ghetto are saying, hey, look at me, take account of me, I'm a person. You're going to pay some attention to me because I'm going to walk down your main street in the middle of the day. I'm black, I'm a person, I'm poor, I'm an American, and I will not let you rest in your tranquil community any longer." End quote. The most important and interesting passage from Wilmore's speech showed how the Watts Rebellion had really changed his perspective. He said, "What can we learn about these riots? As brilliant as the civil rights leaders are," and here he's talking about Dr. King and other Southern black clergy, "as brilliant as these civil rights leaders are, they do not know what it is to fight policemen every night. They don't know what it is to fight rats all day, to have to sit up in bed with a pair of shoes to throw at them. They don't know what it is to be literally emasculated by your wife who works when you can't work, who's able to earn something in a white suburban kitchen. They do not know what it is to have their dignity taken away from them by the condition of the American Negro family in the deepest heart of the ghettos of the North and West." End quote. He added that the civil rights movement as it had been led thus far, quote, "does not reach the deepest needs of these people, which is spiritual as well as material," end quote. Gayraud Wilmore had grown up in the ghettos of the North and West in Philadelphia. His mother had earned a living for the family by working in white suburban kitchens, and his father was unemployed and seeking work for long stretches of his childhood during the Great Depression. So Wilmore saw himself in these Watts rebels, and he recognized that the Southern clergy, like Dr. King, many of them who were more middle class, had certainly faced their own forms of suffering under Jim Crow, but they did not really fully understand the plight of urban, poor, non-Southern African Americans from places like Watts and Philadelphia, a plight that Wilmore himself knew very well. Less than a year later, in June 1966, the term Black Power went viral after the Memphis to Jackson March Against Fear. This term heralded this more militant phase of the civil rights movement and reflected a lot of these concerns of Black people in the slums of these non-Southern cities. Gayraud Wilmore responded by immediately teaming up with Benjamin Payton, his counterpart with the National Council of Churches, and working out a Black Christian response to this new idea of Black Power. 6 weeks after the March Against Fear, these two Black directors of racial justice programs for majority white church organizations, they co-founded the National Committee of Black Churchmen, the NCBC. And that organization went through several different name changes, but that was the name by which I think it is best known, the NCBC. And they released the new group's first public statement as a Christian endorsement of Black Power in a full-page ad in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, with 48 signatories from several denominations, mostly Northern Black clergy, many of them from majority white denominations. And they thought of themselves as a more radical Northern counterpart to Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was the beginning of the academic field of Black theology, trying to figure out a Christian basis, a theological basis for Black Power. Wilmore was the head of the group's theological commission, which meant that he was the one who actually wrote most of its public statements. The specific term Black theology seems to have arisen from this group's discourse during the year 1968. It appeared in a couple of news articles about the NCBC's second convocation in St. Louis, and in a report by Gayraud Wilmore for the group's theological commission that year, and he used the term twice in that report. He wrote that the commission was working to bring Black scholars together, quote, on a few key questions in the current discussion about a Black theology. He said that there was a feeling in this circle that, quote, something is stirring in parts of the Black church, that there is a kind of Black theology aborning. These are the first two written references ever that we know of to the term Black theology. And both times he puts the term in quotes, indicating this is a new idea that he's talking about. Now, Wilmore never claimed to have invented the term, and what may have happened was that it sort of came into use in conversation among these Black pastors and scholars organically, but it could be that Wilmore was the one who chose those words to encapsulate the set of ideas swirling among his associates. Either way, this is the first known use of that term in print by a supporter of the idea of Black theology. And as a side note, the term womanist theology also comes from Black Presbyterians. The term womanist was popularized by the novelist Alice Walker, but the term womanist theology was first used by the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. So Black Presbyterians deserve credit for giving us at least the terms for both Black theology and womanist theology. Now, some of you might wonder, where was James Cone in all of this? Isn't he the one who really came up with Black theology? Well, Cone was certainly the most important early figure in popularizing the term and in filling out its theological content, but he was building on the work of these other scholars. By the time Cone's first book came out in April 1969, Wilmore had been leading the National Conference of Black Churchmen for 3 years, developing this concept of Black theology. And then here comes this unknown theologian named James Cone. Wilmore wrote of this moment, quote, "I remember someone giving me a review of Cone's book in an unguarded moment. I whooped for joy. Here was a mature and scholarly presentation, albeit ebullient with youth, of what we could not find words to say from the first day that Benjamin Peyton and I sat down in his office to compose the draft of the Black Power Statement. Who was this young professor who articulated the faith of the new breed of Black churchmen as if he had been present at every interminable committee meeting and midnight bull session that had taken place among the members of the NCBC from its inception? It was for me a moment of spiritual exaltation, and I went out to find the book, which I read through in one sitting." Wilmore and these Black scholars had started the conversation. They had brainstormed about it and had built a network, but they had not yet really been able to put together a coherent, systematic way of articulating their theology. And then James Cone shows up, and he does that part of it for them, and they welcome him into their ranks with open arms. Now, there's one other piece of this story of the origins of Black theology, and that's the way that Black theology arose, in a way, out of the Reformed tradition. We already talked about Wilmore's role with the Book of Confessions and the Confession of 1967. Well, Wilmore walked away from that committee in 63 or 64, really unhappy with that process, despite his important contributions to the confession. And he was kind of reacting against the Reformed tradition at the time, or at least he was reacting against the Reformed tradition as seen through the lens of these white male, mostly Princeton seminary professors. But even as he felt himself walking away from some aspects of the Reformed tradition, he was drawing on that tradition in other ways. In fact, it's reasonable to see the NCBC and Black theology as, at least in some respects, not a rejection of the Reformed tradition, but as a development within it. For Wilmore, I believe that in creating the statements of the National Conference of Black Churchmen, he was actually creating his own version of a book of confessions, drawing directly on these Reformed documents in creating Black theology. The most intriguing evidence to this effect is Wilmore's reference to the Theological Declaration of Barmen in his 1968 report. That's the report when he first talks about the term Black theology. The Barmen Declaration was an anti-Nazi statement by Reformed churches in 1930s Germany, and it was one of the 8 confessions which formed the new Presbyterian Book of Confessions starting in 1967. The Barmen Declaration arose out of a situation known as a status confessionis. A status confessionis is a term in Reformed theology which refers to a dire situation, a serious crisis, when one must draw a line in the sand by writing a confession. The Confession of 1967 was not really that kind of confession. It was focused on clearing up some vexing issues of biblical and confessional interpretation, not on responding to a major crisis. But that was Wilmore's problem with it. He did think there was a dire, serious crisis going on, the crisis of racism in America. In his 1968 report, he wrote that NCBC members hoped to create, quote, some kind of barman declaration of black churchmen in the face of the repressive and genocidal racism of American society, end quote. He also wrote that black scholars were trying to develop, quote, a basic NCBC theological position paper, an embryonic confessional statement, or a contemporary pronouncement akin to the Barman Declaration. I think that Wilmore thought the church was in a status confessionis, a crisis situation comparable to that of Nazi Germany, to which it must respond clearly and directly. And when the Presbyterian drafting committee didn't recognize that, he went out and set up his own committee to create a confession, indeed a book of confessions, responding to the crisis of racism in America. And I think we can see all of the NCBC's public documents as that book of confessions for the tradition of black theology, at least the beginning of a book of confessions for black theology. Now, black theology is a much broader idea than just the thought of James Cone, Gayraud Wilmore, or the NCBC. But I think it is fair to say that the way this form of theology arose in the 1960s was a direct result of a black Presbyterian leader drawing, at least in part, on the theology of the Reformed tradition, such that black theology, or at least this form of black theology, was a development within the Reformed tradition. And I think this should be a reminder to us that while the Reformed tradition sort of comes out of Europe, it is ever reforming and is always being reshaped and reframed in new contexts. So that's the story of how black theology comes from black Presbyterianism. And I also want to tell you a little about Wilmore's engagement with the idea of reparations. James Cone's first book came out in April 1969, but it was actually another publication that same month that caught more headlines and took up most of Wilmore's energy for the rest of that year. And that was the Black Manifesto, a document produced by activist James Forman, demanding that the nation's white churches and synagogues pay $500 million in reparations due to their past complicity in slavery and discrimination. This document didn't capture the nation's attention until May 1969, when Forman marched into Sunday worship at Riverside Church in New York City to present the manifesto over the protests of the church's pastor and many of its members. Over the next few months, Forman and his associates made similar demands at the headquarters of many majority white denominations and religious institutions. These events were a shock to white mainline church leaders in majority white denominations like the Presbyterians, churches that had made public commitments to racial justice. A lot of these white folks were proud of the work that their denominations had done, and they felt stung by the idea that the white church was still the problem. And this sting was compounded for them by the fact that many of the black clergy in their denominations came out in support of the manifesto and said, yes, our denominations are complicit and they do owe reparations. Many of these black clergy were already members of the NCBC and they were supportive of black power and black theology. And this is where Wilmore's unique style of leadership comes back in again. Janet Harbison, the white woman who was on the confession committee with him, she described him as a solid black hyphen, which is to say he was a hyphen in that he was a connector, a bridge builder, but he was also solidly black. He was firmly committed to black people and racial justice. And you can see that here in this moment. He fully supports reparations, but he does so with a kind of a translating discourse designed to reach out to white liberals and convince them to come around to support it as well. Wilmore was radical, but he was also an official with institutional power. Remember, he was still the head of the denomination's Racial Justice Committee. And he used that position to support more radical figures from a position of apparent moderation and respectability and power. So he did this work of translating in the same way that he explained the Watts Rebellion in Montreat, and all the way back in his college days, the way that he'd used his student newspaper to explain the tactics of the student NAACP. And if you remember, Wilmore had written of that rough-edged student NAACP leader, Milton Henry. On occasion, he may be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of Milton Henry has nothing to do with the rightness of Milton Henry's fight for civil rights in Oxford. Well, now, Wilmore was basically saying of James Forman He might be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of James Foreman has nothing to do with the rightness of reparations. Wilmore did this work of translation in a couple of different ways. James Foreman was an atheist and a Marxist, and he kept disrupting church services, so he was an abrasive figure to white liberal Christians. So what Wilmore did was he defended him by calling him a prophet. As you all know, prophets in the Bible are often disruptive, abrasive figures, and they bring people messages they don't want to hear. And so by calling Foreman a prophet, Wilmore could therefore account for his sort of outlandish behavior and style, while at the same time underscoring the potential truth of his message. Wilmore also defended Foreman's disruptive strategy, his tactics of confrontation, like marching into churches and taking over denominational headquarters. Wilmore said this, quote, "If these tactics are wrong, then the triumphal entry was wrong, the temple cleansing was wrong, so was the civil disobedience of the early church, the nailing of the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, the Boston Tea Party, the conspiracy against the Fugitive Slave Act, and demonstrations, strikes, and boycotts of the labor movement for recognition and collective bargaining. If American Christians can no longer condone violence, they must at least concede that disruptive confrontation is as Christian as street corner revivals and as American as the 4th of July." Wilmore and other Black Presbyterians also secured a speaking slot for James Foreman at the denomination's General Assembly in 1969. Not everyone was happy about this. There was some fiery criticism of the idea of reparations, as you might expect. One prominent lay leader reportedly threatened violence against Wilmore for inviting Foreman, and some commissioners reportedly talked about buying baseball bats or toothpicks to use against Foreman and his followers if necessary. But there were actually more dangerous things going on behind the scenes, where Wilmore had to do some dicey negotiating that none of those other commissioners knew about at the time. During the assembly, Wilmore's San Antonio hotel suite was occupied by an armed group of young Black revolutionaries, sympathetic to Foreman, but probably not under his control. And this group planned to train their guns on the assembly from the balcony and demand reparations by force, which would have rendered baseball bats little more use than actual toothpicks. After several days of secret negotiations, Wilmore talked them out of this scheme. James Foreman and his associates were unsuccessful in securing reparations from almost all of the institutions they approached. The two most prominent exceptions were the Episcopal Church, which did set up a kind of a reparations fund, and the Presbyterian Church, the United Presbyterian Church. At its assembly, its General Assembly, the Presbyterian Church dedicated $100,000 to a relief organization connected to Foreman, and they promised to eventually raise another $50 million, quote, "to be used in depressed areas and among depressed people," end quote. The next year, at the 1970 General Assembly, Wilmore and other Black Presbyterians convinced the denomination to create a new initiative for economic empowerment, the Program for the Self-Development of People. In its first 10 years, this program provided over $20 million in community development grants in poor communities, allowing members of those communities to manage the funds themselves, based on the principle of self-determination from the Black Power movement. If the name Self-Development of People sounds familiar to you, that's because this program is still active today, dispersing several $100,000 annually, relying on an offering taken up once a year in Presbyterian congregations, the One Great Hour of Sharing offering. Now, can we really call this program reparations? Yes and no. Self-development makes grants based on social class, not race. And the denomination has also not referred to it as reparations, at least not since the 1970s and maybe ever. So when people give money to it, they think of it as just another charitable gift, not as paying a debt or as back pay. Also, while it's a substantial amount of money, the fund pales in comparison to what is actually owed, the wealth actually accrued from centuries of unpaid labor. On the other hand, there are some reasons why maybe we should describe self-development as reparations. It does draw on the Black Power idea of self-determination, that the local community should decide how the funds get spent. And it did arise as a direct, specific response to demands for reparations. So that was its original purpose. And also, I think that most of the time, when the idea of reparations comes up, people often dismiss it really quickly and say, it's not realistic, it's too complicated. Reparations would never work, right? When people say that kind of thing, they're usually thinking about the idea that the federal government would make direct cash payments. And indeed, that seemed a little far-fetched, at least until everybody started getting direct cash payments this year because of COVID, and we learned they can cut checks pretty quickly. But what self-development of people shows is a precedent for reparations, and that there are smaller ways that other organizations besides the federal government can do reparations, like how some universities, like Georgetown University, have been talking about having legacy status for Black students or scholarships for Black students as a form of reparations. If the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church, has paid something like reparations on a regular basis for the past 50 years, then we know some form of reparations can work because it has worked, at least in these small ways. It's not some impossible utopian idea. And so, I think we could consider this program as one of the most successful reparations efforts in U.S. history. And we have Black Presbyterians like Gayraud Wilmore to thank for that. So those are a few of the contributions of Gayraud Wilmore, who along with other Black Presbyterians has reshaped or reformed the Reformed tradition from within in a direction of racial justice. Black Presbyterian college students and seminarians used some of the first sit-ins to get the civil rights movement started. Black Presbyterians led the creation of perhaps the most successful reparations effort in U.S. history. And Black Presbyterians not only helped create the Book of Confessions, they also both reacted against and drew on those aspects of the Reformed tradition to create, in a sense, the idea of Black theology, including Black theology's own Book of Confessions. In light of these contributions and many other figures and contributions that I've neglected to mention, I think the tradition and heritage of Black Presbyterianism is one that we can all celebrate, and I'm really glad we've had the chance to do that here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Brings the narrative of Black leadership in the church and Black Presbyterian leadership in society up to the present, and with present day prophet as well as the prophets of yesteryear. I want to move quickly now to questions that have come in. I'm going to move from one speaker to another, and then we will have a couple of questions for both of you. Some of these are just clarification of some relationships and facts. And if you can be very brief about these, that would be helpful. First, Dr. Prelo, can you clarify the relationship of Francis to the Grimke sisters? You said Angelina was his aunt, I believe. And what about Sarah? Okay, we'll get you unmuted. Sorry. Yvonne, is that me?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. The Grimke brothers, Francis and Archibald. Well, first, thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for your talk. I really appreciated hearing about Gayraud Wilmore, Dr. Wilmore, and I do remember fondly your visit with Dr. Gayraud Wilmore to 15th Street. It was actually my first time meeting him and preaching in front of him. So I was a bit nervous. I didn't know about the visit. So it was really wonderful to have you there. But yes, absolutely. There is the Black Grimke family and there's a white Grimke family, and they are related, originating from Charleston, South Carolina. And so what becomes very interesting about the narrative of the Black Grimke family is that when Francis and Archibald make their journey to Lincoln Seminary, their aunt, Angelina, tracks them down and finds out about this relationship. And because both Angelina and her sister Sarah were abolitionists, it put Francis in a specific role of being connected to the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement. And so really they become part of this educated circle up and down the coast between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. that contributed. And so the narrative is a really interesting one. There could be a talk just on the Grimke family, period, looking at the ebb and flow between slavery and in the ways in which race and separation in families also becomes a paradigm through which we can view racism, both within and outside of the church universal as well. But yeah, very connected roots. And there's some resources I shared that talk about the greater family connection.
Great, thank you so much. A related question, Dr. Clark, are there ways that we can learn from Wilmore about being hyphenated in our church life and our work? And how can we be bridge builders, especially in race relations?
Yes, I think so. That's, I mean, one of the things that I admire about him is the way that he was able to reach out, to be a bridge builder, without kind of selling out people, or without, while still kind of taking seriously the concerns of these different communities, and kind of remembering where he came from and what his commitments were to. And you know, so I think, I mean, a lot of these examples of how he did that, and how he you know, there's some problems with it sometimes if you're trying to say, well, this is what people are really saying, I'm going to sort of speak for them, right? Sometimes that can be a little bit of an issue, and we just let them speak for themselves. But part of our role is we all have different audiences. We all have different people who we're in networks with. And, you know, we have different callings about how to reach out to those people. So, you know, there's a different way that you're going to engage. You know, if you're writing an op-ed, or if you're protesting. In the street, versus if you're, you know, at the Thanksgiving dinner table with your, you know, in my case, you're mostly white family. You know, you might not say the same kind of things. And so, you know, I think they're instructive lessons here for how we remember our commitments, but also, you know, try to use our position, our position and our connections in order to witness in a way that makes sense.
Thank you. Dr. Prelo, what was the Presbyterian Church's official stance on race relations? At the time, there were Northern Church, Southern Church, a church, United Church out of Pennsylvania. But any of these, the stance on race relations, especially during Grimke's own lifetime, and was he explicit about challenging those?
Yeah, that's a whole book by itself. And actually, I think it's a book that needs to be written so that the broader church can understand the ebb and flow about the church's stance on, and we say race relations, I'll make it more specific, and that is about the integration and support of African Americans within the broader church. And actually, it's a question we're still grappling with, trying to understand. Dr. Clark mentioned it briefly about the existence of all Black governing bodies, which we now call presbyteries. So back when the Black Presbyterian churches were segregated under their own distinct presbytery, this is before reunion in the early 80s, Black Presbyterian churches belonged to their own segregated bodies. And so what you all received today was just a snippet of Black Presbyterian history from the lens really of Henry Highland Garnett, Francis Grimke, and Gayraud Wilmore. But there is a whole established unique culture of being Black and Presbyterian. In fact, Katie Geneva Cannon grew up Presbyterian, and all she ever knew was a Black Presbyterian space. So when we raise a question about the church's official stance, it depends on time period. But for Black Presbyterians, they are as Presbyterian as anyone else. And so the church's stance, I think, for the most part, follows the stance of the larger society. And so when we split over slavery, we grapple with that. When we were late in coming back together in terms of reunion, we did it in the early 80s as opposed to other ecclesial bodies that did it in the late 60s and 70s. So to even raise the context of civil rights and Black power, I do want to point out that not every Black Presbyterian affirms Black power. So that goes back to the identity of the ways in which Black power is not only a theology, but it is also the ways in which Black people describe their theology, and more specifically, how they understand Jesus to be liberator. That's the key about Black theology. But how that connects with the church's stance, I really think is a question still yet being waited to resolve. It also relates to, if I can just jump into this other question real quick, Dr. Goldman, about what the church can do about racism. And I would say first and foremost, it is to understand that the Reformed Church is still reforming, right? But first and foremost, to understand that what it means to be Presbyterian depends on where your vantage point is in the life of the church. And so what we really need to do is to do more of what we are doing today. The narrative and history of Black Presbyterians shouldn't be a special event. It should be a part of our lived normative understanding of the Presbyterian Church in the U.S.
Wonderful, thank you. Speaking of Black theology, Black power, Dr. Clark, can you say more about making the argument for Black theology in part coming out of Reformed theology, and maybe a couple of theological points about that? And then do you have a good recommendation of a primer for Black theology for those who don't know it?
Yes, thank you. I mean, you know, again, there are different ways to define it, right? If you want to look at this specific movement, this which comes out of the Black Power era and these Black clergy, but then develops considerably over time through ideas and the idea of Jesus as a liberator in conversation with other liberation theologies, which see God working from the perspective of the poor, or from the perspective of women, or Black women, women of color in the case of womanist theology. And so it changes and grows over time, and it's transformed. And so this is just one kind of specific way that it comes out, that there are these connections to Reformed theology. So I certainly wouldn't say the entire tradition comes from that, but it's like a significant moment in kind of the founding of that tradition. In terms of a primer, I don't have a recommendation for. I mean, there's a documentary source reader that has a lot of these primary sources. It's Black Theology, a documentary history, that's edited by James Cone and Gayraud Wilmore, and includes a lot of these early figures, and then other folks from the 70s and 80s and 90s, especially women. And you can look at the works of many of these figures: James Cone, Dolores Williams, Kelly Brown Douglas, and people like that. So,
if you don't mind listing one or two titles in the chat box for everyone, Dr. Clark, that would be great. I just want to add to that, Fred Ware out of Howard University School of Divinity has written his first volume of African American theology, and takes a kind of doctrinal loci stance of God and Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit, things of that sort. He's Pentecostal by background, so it's quite an interesting book. Dr. Prelo, a primer you'd recommend?
I actually concur with Dr. Clark in terms of the documented volume. I think one can read books on a narrative interpretation of Black theology, but really to get at the heart of what it's about, to really begin to read actually many of the primary documents that Dr. Clark referenced in his work. But I did want to add one other. Can I piggyback onto the question you just asked, Dr. Clark, Dr. Goldman? And
sure.
That is this, I don't want to call it tension, but this relationship between reform, even just the word reform, let's begin there, the relationship between reform and Black theology, and then how that intersects with the lived realities of Black women who, regardless of denomination, continue to be builders of the Black church. When I say Black church, I'm using that universal. And so Union Presbyterian Seminary, as a way to lift up the legacy of Kata Geneva Cannon, has developed the Black Womanist Leadership Institute. So please do look at their website. But in part, womanist theologians are raising the important question of critiquing both, scholars of the Reformed tradition, and also scholars of the Black liberation theology, but really arguing that liberation is not just about liberation related to race. It is about the intersection of identities, namely race, class, gender, sexuality. So I say all that today to say even Black liberation theology in and of itself, even though it's only been around for about 30, 40 years, is being reshaped even as we continue to speak, not just about women's theology, but also about the ways in which Black liberation theology then and of itself becomes a springboard for queer theology as well.
Excellent. I want to come back to intersectionality between these issues in a moment. One quick historical question for each of you. Dr. Clark, the early sit-ins at Lincoln University in the 1940s, were these some of the earliest known sit-ins in an educational setting, and where else might that have been going on?
So there's a historian, Glenda Gilmore, says that the Howard University sit-ins in DC in the 1943 and 44 were the earliest sit-ins in the South. And Pauli Murray, if you've heard of Pauli Murray, she was involved in that as a Howard Law student, and there were Howard undergrads involved as well. I also know Bayard Rustin, who was a very important civil rights leader. He started practicing a lot of the techniques of nonviolent civil disobedience while he was in prison in World War II as a conscientious objector, and that included him and other prisoners doing what he called, I think he called the stool sitting technique at that time. So there may have been others, but you know, those are the kind of earliest ones that I know about.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll move back to Dr. Prelo if we can get her unmuted again. I don't know how that's happening. I'm trying to locate your place, but let me share the question in the meantime, and that is, did other Black pastors in DC, AME, Baptist, etc., have any kind of cooperative organization or compact with Francis Grimke and 15th Street? And here we are trying to unmute you. Okay, I've got one, and there you are.
Thank you. So actually, the first pastor of 15th Street, John Cook, was an AME pastor. So we meaning the Presbyterian, I wasn't there at the time, clearly, but what was then the origins of National Capital Presbyterian wanted to develop a church specifically for Black Presbyterians. And so went through the process of trying to find a local pastor, and John Cook was AME. And so I would say the questions around the color line in a district were questions that all churches worked together to really develop. And the history of where 15th Street was relative to partnering with other Black faith traditions in a district ebbed and flowed. But in all respects, the Black church was deeply concerned with being connectional, to use a Presbyterian word, about the quest for civil rights and social justice. And I will also say that many of these protests, even that Dr. Clark has mentioned in his own research, are born out of not just individual moments of protest, but they're born out of the Black church. And so as much as we can talk about the 30s, 40s, I also contend that the protests actually start even earlier in the context of the 1920s on Black college campuses. Johnson T. Smith University, for example, a Black Presbyterian college I referenced in my research, located in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so what Dr. Clark has also mentioned is the existence of the longue durée Black freedom movement. So you can take the activism of Francis Grimke and Gayraud Wilmore, although, you know, really speaking to two different kind of audiences. Grimke's activism was, you know, more about the written word, but they represent a continuum really from the 1930s on through the present.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to move into questions related to our situation. And you mentioned the multiple pandemics, Dr. Prelo, in Grimke's own time, and the parallels now, and we'll begin with Dr. Clark and then move to Dr. Prelo. These are for both of you. The multiple pandemics that people have addressed today, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the racial justice struggles pandemic to the dysfunction of politics pandemic. Does that raise a status confessionis for us today, in which the church needs to not only actively be engaged, but perhaps also come up with a new confession of some kind?
I mean, it's often hard to evaluate the moment that you're living in, but it certainly feels like that to me. I mean, there are a lot of things going on, but we're in a really important moment in terms of the pandemic, and a really important moment in terms of race in the United States. You know, not only because of the racial justice demonstrations last year, but also because of you know, the attack on the Capitol, which was a very racial event as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly a time for the church to speak up about these kinds of things. And, you know, the parallels to the time that I'm really talking about, the late 60s, are pretty strong in terms of a militant group of African American protesters who make white people nervous in certain ways, and in terms of a really strong white backlash or attack against those kinds of things in the presidency of Donald Trump in the first place, and in incidents like the one from a couple of weeks ago. So,
excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Prelo, the threefold pandemic and...
Just to jump in, because I could talk about this all day for a couple hours. But briefly, Eddie Glade wrote a couple of years ago an op-ed in a newspaper. I just put the link in the chat. And he raised the question, is the Black church dead? Meaning, what is the relationship of the Black church, and again, using the Black Church Universal, to activism in the community? And so when we saw the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C., that's the first time that there was a social movement, the continuum from civil rights to Black power, then to Black Lives Matter. That social movement was developed solely outside of the church. And so now Black churches, and dare I say Black Presbyterian churches, even as in National Capital Presbytery, there's an organization called Black Presbyterians United, and we are forever really thinking, discerning about the relevancy of the witness that we profess in Christ to what is happening in a larger society. So, you know, I would say that it is raising the question of what does activism birth out of the Missio Dei of Christ, the liberation of Christ, and what does it look like? It's one thing to say civil rights, Black power, or even Black Lives Matter, but I think the pandemic of race is forcing the church, and dare I say the broader Presbyterian church, to question what is social witness looks like. And furthermore, we cannot separate the pandemic of COVID-19 from the pandemic of race, because there is race around Black Lives Matter, but a lot of the concerns that are being raised are not just dealing with you know, interactions between police and people of color, but it's also dealing with systemic racism, equality around education, literacy, and healthcare. And as we know, if you look at the stats, people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID deaths. So, you know, I think the church is at a crossroads, to use old language, but I will say that, you know, systemically we're looking at. And then lastly, you know, it is a heavy weight, but God provides, to preach from our nation's capital every week in light of these pandemics. And just because we are in a new time does not mean that the pandemics have gone away. They are still very much present, and it does not yet appear how, as a nation, we will continue to be shaped by these pandemics. I just think about, you know, 100-year difference between the time that Reverend Francis Grimke preached and the time that I'm preaching. And I feel like people keep asking me, well, what do you think? I'm like, I'm still trying to live through the pandemic myself, but it is still a sobering reality to think about these questions around race and health and politics continue to shape our realities, but it just requires a moral response, and it is our faith in action.
Thank you very much. There is a question about how studying Grimke shapes your pastorate at 15th, so I invite you to write a little paragraph about that in the chat, or place it in the context of this next question for both of you. And Dr. Clark, will begin with you. How can the Presbyterian Church today address systemic racism more effectively? And can you place the conversation of reparations, whether we need to reclaim that and move that as an example among that larger question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a really dramatic moment, and it's important for the church to speak up. The church does not have the same kind of power that it had in the 1960s. That was sort of the pinnacle of the Presbyterian Church's financial and political and members sort of power, and it's not in the same place now. But it still has to speak out, and it has to work both internally and externally in terms of being prophetic. Representation is really important. Shared power is really important. I mean, that's a lot of the concerns that I was seeing in my work, was ways that was done poorly, where Black people and people of color were sort of included, but in paternalistic ways. So constantly thinking about that. And somebody said in the chat about being honest and transparent, being honest about things like white privilege, and that relates to reparations, and being honest about the ways that the church and that white people, have benefited from slavery. And so there's a question in terms of self-development of people about being kind of transparent and honest about that, and kind of should we come out and put on the website we're doing reparations, right? I mean, the risk of that is that people don't give money, and so the money then doesn't go to the people that need it, because reparations is a controversial idea. But it's also a way to witness to that kind of thing. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about reparations these last few years, and then there have been a few really interesting efforts like Georgetown's and others. And we have this history as a denomination of some successes and a lot of failures in not listening to people like Wilmore. And that's something we can draw on and bring to the conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Prelo, follow up on that. And can you give us your 2-minute charge for Presbyterians and other good church folk about next steps, something we can do, one thing or two things we can do to help our churches engage more effectively in this issue, especially white dominant churches.
Okay, a preacher and a pastor, 2 minutes. But really, first, let me just say, the conversation on reparations, you cannot have reparations without an engagement with talking about white privilege, but I'll go one step forward and say white complicity. We look at the conversation around privilege and also to confession. Reparations is not just about writing a check or giving to an offering. It is about doing the hard work of looking at white complicity in the midst of racial injustice, and also to confession. You start with confession. But I have 1 minute. So my 1 minute charge would be to do this. Go beyond the silos of racialized spaces in faith communities. And what I mean by that is that show up, come worship with me and others at 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Engage in dialogue around intersectional injustice, right? Because sometimes we just loosen the conversation to be about race, but it's not just about race. It's also about, we have systemic class and economic injustice all across our church. And so it is about looking at the ways in which race, economics, class, sexuality, especially sexuality in this time, all intersect. And we just really need to be in a place of having these conversations beyond special events like a convocation. That's where it is starting. But lastly, I will say that the work of justice too needs to move beyond confession, sitting with one's complicity. Reading books and having conversation are starting points, but we now need to move toward looking at how our organizations, whether it's the Reformed Institute, National Capital Presbytery, various mission boards across the life of our church, how our practices of gathering and our practices of being community contribute to ongoing racism and institutionalized injustice. So we need to make the shift from confession to transforming practice, which gets us back to the Reformed tradition, reform and always reforming.
Thank you.
Grateful, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I want to extend a thanks to our two remarkable presenters for this day. Encourage you to be in touch with them if you have further questions that you want to address. We look forward to future events with all the members of the Reformed Institute congregations and all other congregations in the National Capital Presbytery that could join us. Also to congregations and people from across the country that were able to join. Event yearly that we do, and we would like to get this event endowed in the name of an individual or in the name of a congregation or organization. So consider talking to us in planned giving efforts or in special grant efforts that your organization or congregation may have about endowing this as First Church of somewhere annual convocation, or Mr. and Mrs. Something annual convocation. We welcome those conversations so that this kind of work can be extended. I want to turn finally again to Reverend Neil Morgan for our closing words.
Here I am. I can talk now. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming and joining with us today. It's just such a wonderful event every year, and we're glad that this year, with these two magnificent scholars, that we've been able to include people from all over the United States and in Mexico. And we hope that next year, when we are together, that we'll be able, through technology, to stream again, but also that we can welcome many of you, that we'll be able to welcome many of you as well to Washington, D.C., back in Stone Hall at National Presbyterian Church. I've included the website link in the chat, and if you are part of a congregation that's not yet a sponsoring congregation and you'd like to explore that possibility, I'd encourage you to do that. Click on that link, go to the webpage, and click on Contact Us. And we would love to have you become part of this effort for the Reformed Institute. Thank you all. And let's close with prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks today, especially for the gifts of Dr. Prelo and Dr. Clark, for the ways that you move among us by your Spirit. Open our hearts and minds to our history and open before us a path where there is more justice, more enlightenment, more courage, and that your kingdom continues to break in to this world. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch with us and with our speakers with further questions. So please, you could be with us.